My paper is too long, so I shall summarize the first few pages by giving you a synopsis of what the texts are telling you. First text: anonymous instructions to Baal to go down into the underworld. Text 2: Ael hears the news that Baal has gone down. He goes into mourning. Followed by Anat, who finds the body and also goes into mourning. Text 3: Shapshu, the sun goddess, puts the corpse of Baal on Anat's shoulders and she buries him in offering a hecatomb of 70 animals of various species. Text 4: she refers bitterly to Athirat's assumed satisfaction at the death of Baal. Text 5: Ael is speaking. Baal is really dead, but peut-être in a dream. And finally he rejoices because he realizes that Baal has come back to life. There are three main discussions of this material in recent years, which I'll deal with. Firstly, the article in the Encyclopedia of Religion by Jonathan Z., for Americans Z. Smith, in 1987. He was enthralled to the old idea that the seasonal pattern applied across the board in Ugaritic religion. He looked at dying and rising gods all over the ancient Near East and pointed out that this god died but wasn't revived, that god disappeared but didn't really die, and so on. And he came up with the conclusion that there was no clear evidence for dying and rising gods in the Near East, including Baal. He dismissed the whole idea. His theory was based on the work of people like Fraser, the Golden Bough, Le Rameau d'Or, G.R. Driver, Theodore Gaster, not Cyrus Gordon, I'll exclude him, Arvid Kappelrud, Virolo, Saint-Charles, and Johannes de Moor, who all argued for a seasonal pattern, insisting that Ugaritic religion was essentially a fertility cult, simply playing through the sequence of the seasons with the appropriate rituals. And this was carried to its most absurd extreme by Johannes de Moor, who had rituals for almost every day of the year in the text of the Baal cycle, corresponding to the meteorological calendar of Ougarit. Totally absurd. But that's the manière de penser among our ancestors. Mark Smith took this whole discussion up in 1998 in an important article, 50-page article in the Scandinavian Journal for the Old Testament. He began with the following observations, and I'll have to abbreviate his arguments too. It is important to note, he said, the limits imposed by the Baal cycle about Baal's death and return to life. The extant Baal cycle never recounts Baal's return to life. Therefore, any attempt to render a reconstruction of Baal's death and return to life, and this is in italics, should make no assumption about the nature of the latter. Furthermore, Baal does return from the underworld and the realm of death in the Baal cycle. And he goes on, it is especially striking that the rich indigenous corpus of Ugaritic ritual texts does not contain a single indication of the death and rising of Baal. The burden of demonstration for Baal as a dying and rising god, and here crucially, with its attendant ritual background, falls on those who argue for it. It is the assumption of its necessary attendant ritual background which has long muddied the waters of the whole discussion, in accepting as essential the discussion the false linkage which was proposed by Fraser, Gaster, de Moor and others, and even by Jonathan Z. Smith. If we leave the ritual dimension out of account, we are left with a theological issue which is much more useful for the general discussion of resurrection, a point acknowledged by Mark Smith, who thus avoided the ritual trap. He wrote, "The first major point is to recognize its essentially literary character. Unlike Hittite material, neither the Baal cycle nor any other Ugaritic text, ritual or otherwise, link Baal's descent and return to any ritual." And he drew up a number of comparisons between Baal and Telepinu of Hittite mythology, which I'm leaving on one side because it struck me as inconclusive. He didn't prove anything, and of course Telepinu is not a god who dies and rises, so why do we have the discussion anyway? He saw a political element in the development, though, in the relationship as he saw it between the Ugaritic and the Hittite material. The weakness of divine death, in contrast to sleep, may serve to underlie the fragility not merely of Baal's rule, but of the dynasty as well. In contrast, the Hittite dynasty never suffered from the political vassalage which it imposed on Ougarit. And notice the word suffer, which I will come back to. This is a very interesting observation. We should expect theology to have a relationship with the lived experience of a people. But I suspect that the comment overplays the sense of dependency Ougarit had on Hatti, the Hittite Empire, or at any rate the possible trauma suggested by suffered. Nothing in the diplomatic record suggests any exceptional situation. There is no question of military conquest, but rather an alteration of allegiance from Egypt to Hatti, freely accepted by Ougarit, moving from one vassal state to another of her own choice. It is even possible that Ougarit took the initiative in moving from the Egyptian to the Hittite sphere of influence. Besides, the finality of Baal's death is for dramatic purposes only. The poet knows full well that it'll be vindicated by a return to life and power, cemented in victory over Mot, the god of death. Are we to believe that the resurrection was an eschatological end-of-history concept? There is no reason to think so in any absolute sense. But as we shall see, the trope's link with text 1.161, the royal funeral rites, does involve it in a more restricted context concerning beliefs in post-mortem existence in Ougaritian religious thought. Smith referred to a number of other texts beside the Hittite ones. The first one is number 6 on your handout, passage from the Akat story. Here, Anat offers the hero Akat eternal life of some kind, and he rejects her advances scornfully. "All I'll ever get," he says, "is the gold and silver which will be placed on my head in terms of a mortuary mask," perhaps alluding to the Mycenaean practice with which Ougarit may well have been familiar. What precisely does Anat offer? On the surface, she simply offers an inducement, which he assumes, that we call that a bribe in English, an inducement which he assumes he will not hesitate to accept, in which case his predictable rejection of the offer merely advances the plot to the next stage. On the other hand, we must remember that Ilimilku, who likely had a measure of authorship in this epic poem, had a professional interest in exploring the theological ideas of this kind. The passage therefore raises interesting questions about post-mortem beliefs in Ougarit. So which of the two characters speaks the truth? Are Akat's words a reflection of current beliefs, or do they reflect a rejection of an idea perhaps gaining credence? Which, if either of the speakers, reflects Ilimilku's views? With regard to this passage, Mark Smith noted Jonas Greenfield's discussion of the Panamua inscription. That's number 7 on your handout. From which it drew, but from it he drew, Panamua inscription, dealing with the king's successor performing the Kispum rites for him. But from it he drew the surely erroneous conclusion that the Baal appearing in lines 28 to 30 of the Akat passage was not the god Baal, but the paterfamilias, here Akat's father Danael. The same also went, Mark Smith suggested, for the use of Baal in text 1.161, line 20, denoting the deceased king Nikmadu IV, or if plural, previous generations, and presumably addressed to Hammurabi, who on this understanding, the last king of Ougarit, goes down into the tomb at the appropriate juncture of the funeral ritual, presumably as a ritual statement of solidarity between the generations, perhaps performing the Kispum at this juncture during the funeral ceremony. This interpretation is certainly an intelligent reading of the latter text. Its implications for Akat are slightly more problematic. Here again are the key lines from the Akat passage, text 6. I shall make you number years with Baal, with the son of Ale you shall number months. Like Baal he shall live indeed, change of person, alive he shall be feasted. Given that the Ili Milku material has a particular concern with royal ideology, it is important to remember that Danael, here the Baal in question on Smith's argument, though he is at present still alive, is a royal figure. So if this argument were cogent, it would reinforce my account of Danael's status. An interesting little detail in this passage may argue in favour of Smith's argument. This is the title Son of Ale, in parallel to the divine name Baal. Notwithstanding the formulaic Bull Ale his father used of Baal in the so-called plea passages where he's asking for a temple, or Anat speaks on his behalf in 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 and again 1.6 of the Baal cycle, he's normally called son of Dagan in Ili Milku's writings. 4 times the former formula, 13 times the latter. In the present passage, it may be argued that were the deity intended, the second colon would more likely identify him as son of Dagan. So the actual use of son of God, son of Ale here may point in another direction. We know that the king in Ougarit was given this title. In text 16, column 1, the Kirta story, he is said to be a son of Ale. A passage repeated 3 times in which Kirta lies sick in bed while his son laments the crisis. On the other hand, Anat's words, I shall make you number years with Baal, with the son of Ale you shall number months, in terms of ideological presuppositions and the association of the deceased with the storm god, bear a striking similarity to the formulaic language of Panamua. This is text 7. May the dead spirit of Panamua eat with you, that is Adad, and may the dead spirit of Panamua drink with you. And again later in the same text, may the dead spirit of Panamua eat with Hadad, may the dead spirit of Panamua drink with Hadad. This should give us pause. Is there a way to resolve the difficulty of 2 apparently contradictory senses, or to harmonize the conflicting interpretations? The only possibility of this seems to me to be if the dead king were to be regarded as assimilated to Baal. But while this is not an impossible concept, I find no clear supporting evidence in Akat. Of course, religious systems have never been averse to holding contradictory concepts simultaneously. They are, after all, symbolic rather than logical formulations. However, the Panamua evidence, even though from a different historical context, tells against, or at least weakens, the Smith hypothesis with regard to Akat. Now, if what Ili Milku is describing in Anat's words was the current royal ideology, however the impasse just noted be resolved, Akat's contrary words cannot be taken as a serious alternative view, unless he is the mouthpiece for a non-royal belief system. The only clear parallel to the situation he seems to envisage is the gold masks of the royal dead from Mycenae. So Akat's answer may mask a more complex situation than is immediately apparent. A possible analogue to his position is the negative view expressed in a number of biblical passages, like Psalm 6, Psalm 115, Isaiah 38, in which we have denials, apparent denials, of belief in life after death. But it would be wrong to interpret these literally as indicating an absence of such beliefs. They are best viewed psychologically as a cri de coeur, the expression of a state of denial or fear by those anticipating death or in mourning as a result of it. The psalm passages and perhaps Akat's response are more of an emotional outburst than a formal statement of a dissident doctrine. The other Ugaritic text addressed by Smith was text 1.161. This is number, hang about, I've given you a bit of it on number 8 on the handout. This describes, and may even be the liturgy or a synopsis of it, for the funeral ceremony of Nikmadu IV, the penultimate king of Ougarit, together with an affirmation of his successor's legitimate installation. Following the important study of Levine and de Tarragon, Mark Smith drew the closest parallels between the royal rite and the mythic account of Anat's search for and retrieval of Baal's corpse. Many of the points of contact noted are both perceptive and salient. These were as follows. 1. The mourning rituals described in both texts correspond in many details. 2. In both, the family mourner is to locate the departed in the netherworld and be brought back. The wording initially corresponding very closely in both texts. 3. The sun goddess accompanies the family member of the ritual descent in both cases. 4. Both texts bring the ritual account to an end with a series of offerings, magnified, of course, hugely in scale in the Baal cycle. The key passage in text 1.161 regarding the all-important descent reads as follows. This is lines 18 following. Go down, Shapsh, yea, go down, great luminary. May Shapsh shine upon him. After your lords from the throne, after your lords, into the underworld go down, into the underworld go down and fall into the dust, down to Sidanu and Radanu, down to the eternal one, Tharu, down to the ancient Rapi Uma, down to Amith Tamru, the king, last king but one, also down to Nigmadu, the king who's just died. I'm in agreement with both Smith and Mark Siriano that lines 20 to 26 constitute an instruction to the living king, Hammurabi, to go down into the underworld, accompanied by the sun goddess as psychopomp, probably, of course, in the form of an image of the goddess. For this crucial part of the rite, involving the living king making contact with his dead ancestors and offering them cult, lines 27 to 30, is as much an initiation into his new role as it is a placation and nourishing of the dead. Like the kispum, I'm not saying it is one, but it's an analogous, it serves to actualize his newly acquired authority as a new king and transfers property rights to him as heir. Come finally to the work of Messenger, the Danish scholar, Trygve Messenger. Messenger wrote a monograph on the subject addressed here, published in 2001, The Miracle of the Resurrection, examining the case of Baal in some detail. He criticized Mark Smith's view that the imperative Radu in 1.161 line 21 was addressed to Hammurabi, preferring the older view of Lure and Taylor that it addressed the furniture of the king. But in my view, Smith's and later Mark Siriano's account is more persuasive and conforms, for example, to the language and implied ritual action of both Ale and Anat. Continuing criticism of the whole approach of Levine and de Tarragon and of Smith, Messenger stated, 1. In text 1.161, there is no search for the dead king. But if it is the new king who goes down into the tomb, on the argument of Smith and Siriano just outlined, this caveat falls. He may not be searching, but on the basis of his descent, he goes down to encounter the dead, including his father. The search is mythically implicit in his descent. Secondly, the seasonal features, and this is where I think Messenger gives a hostage, the seasonal features of the Baal cycle, rain and drought, are strikingly absent, he says, from the latter text. They are certainly not explicit in 1.161, but the correspondence is made very precisely in the potential funeral crisis in Kirta, where the king is at death's door and contingencies are evoked as in text 10. When Kirta is dying, the whole world begins to fall apart. I previously drawn attention to the parallels between this passage and those in the Baal cycle. Handout 11, I've given you the references without giving you the whole. Am I right? Yes. Well, the two texts are in parallel there. The dying god and the dying king, I noted in an earlier article, evoke the same literary response and one suspects the same theological response. That's the quotation. The same theological mind and ideology, Ili Milku's, lies behind both compositions. This parallel demonstrates the common thought behind all Ili Milku's work. While the Kirta passage is on the occasion of a king's threatened death, we must remember that the Akat is also a royal son. In the similar passage, it's in handout number 12, where we have all kinds of dreadful things happening when the news of Akkad's death becomes public. A king's death presages cosmic mayhem. Nothing to do with a seasonal pattern, everything to do with a complete breakdown of a good world. Chaos ensues. 3, still Messenger's objections. Continuing his critique, Messenger noted that, quote, Baal's descent is a passing experience, unquote, while the king's death is permanent. Quote, when he dies, he goes to the netherworld. He then remains there, unquote. I've no space to develop here a full response to this, but I'm not entirely in agreement with it, and the view expressed would need to be modified substantially in view of recent discoveries, such as the Katumua stela, and ongoing discussions on the avian nature of the dead and their subsequent motility. 20 years ago, Mario Korpel, the Dutch scholar, wrote a very interesting article on avian spirits in Ougarit, and a recent book by Richard Steiner called Disembodied Souls looks at the whole biblical view of post-mortem existence in the light of the implications of a Katumua stela. 4. Messenger's 4th point appears to be more substantial. He wrote that Smith is forced to have Baal correspond to both the dead king and the living one. His demise reflects the demise of the Ugaritic kings, but his return to life reflects the role of the living king to provide peace for the world. But the apparent contradiction he saw here is surely precisely the whole point of the divine royal correspondence. Baal's death corresponds to that of Nikmadu IV in the funeral text, while his restoration to life corresponds to the accession of the successor king Amarabi. The concentration of both aspects of royal succession in the person of the chief royal god precisely emphasizes, and by way of performative utterance even realizes, dynastic continuity, the thrust of Matthew Siriano's article. The god functions symbolically as the pivot between the old and the new dispensations. Gods can be in 2 places at once. The king is dead, long live the king. One brief remark to finish on text number 13 and text 13 and 14. These are from the so-called Rapiu text, which we were looking at earlier. The problem here is the identity of the god Rapiu. He is the eponym of the Rapiuma, who are the remote royal ancestors of the dynasty of Ougarit, now firmly divinized. In fact, all the dead kings, I think, are divinized, but they on a higher rank, perhaps, than the more recent ones. May Rapiu, king of eternity, be established, yea, may he be established, the powerful and noble god, the god enthroned in Athtarat, the god who rules in Edrei, etc. There is no consensus over the identity of Rapiu. He has been seen as an independent deity, the eponym of the Rapiuma, Ruphaim in the Bible, as a form of Ale, of Mot, of Milku, of Resheph, and of Baal. In the light of the foregoing, I'm increasingly persuaded that Baal is the most likely candidate. If the parallels between Baal's role and that of dead and living kings outlined above is cogent, then he is in a sense the patron of the monarchy. And the figure of Rapiu has a similar role in representing the entire dynasty of the kings of Ougarit. The case for this identification is perhaps enhanced by the fact that Anat features in the hymn, in the lines of text 14, as well as in the Baal cycle as the firm supporter and champion of Baal, at which point I'll finish and give you time to quiz me.